Gallagher. Here. President Brady.
Here.
We have a quorum. Also like the record to reflect that we have council members Baker, Miller, and Conwell also in attendance.
Thank you, Ashley. Again, good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Ashley, I believe we have several individuals signed in for public comment.
Yes, we do. Mr. Lepley.
If you'd like to come forward, sir. Good morning.
Excuse me, Mr. Lepley, can you press the button on the microphone?
Am I on now? My name is Michael Lepley. I'm here today to talk about the county housing ordinance. I'm the Senior Research Associate with the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research. And part of our mission is to fight for equal housing choice for everyone in Cuyahoga County. I'd like to start by applauding this legislation and saying that it is a wonderful first step in the right direction. We agree that homeowners are struggling in Cuyahoga County and that people need exactly these types of programs in place to access homeownership. We would also argue that it's not enough to just support homeownership, that renters have the greatest need, and programs that support renters ought to be considered as part of this legislation. So if you rent in Cuyahoga County, you're more than twice as likely to be housing insecure or burdened by the cost of your housing as compared to homeowners. If you're a person of color in Cuyahoga County, you're half as likely to be a homeowner. So by considering a safety net for renters or not considering a safety net for renters, you risk disproportionately excluding people of color from a county-wide housing program. We support this ordinance, but we would urge you to consider amending the homeowner assistance piece of this ordinance to be made into a more flexible fund so that it can support those who rent. We would also support an additional category being added to the ordinance that would support renters. Thank you.
Mr. McDermott.
Morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Mark McDermott with Enterprise Community Partners. I'd like to thank our county for the county council for your leadership on meeting this growing and urgent needs around housing in the county. And we're very encouraged by the introduction of the ordinance to establish the county housing program. Eager to work with the committee and members of council as you move to implement it. And we're very supportive of the Cuyahoga County Land Reutilization Corporation, the Land Bank, playing a central role. They're very competent, they're very progressive, they really get things done, as we know. As a member of the County Housing Stakeholders Group, we've worked for 4 years now with a diverse set of stakeholders from around the county and with County Council and the administration to help create this housing plan that we talked about last summer. And within that housing plan, and as you'll remember and you referenced in the legislation, there are 4 areas to address. One is access to capital. Secondly, tax delinquency and foreclosure. Third, special populations. Fourth, housing insecurity. Fifth, fair housing. And sixth, confidence in the housing market. And we really urge the council to think about a comprehensive approach over time to address all of those areas. Primary to our recommendation around that is the creation of a flexible housing fund under the homeowner assistance category, a flexible housing fund that would enable you over time in the county over time to address more than just homeowner assistance, but to address and address things like seniors aging in place, the disabled, veterans, youth aging out of foster care, and eviction prevention as examples. So under that homeowner assistance, we urge you to think about implementing perhaps an emergency rental assistance program that could be flexible, that could address a full range of needs, and that could leverage private dollars. And we have great examples of how to do that in other places. Under the program administration area, we suggest that the council think about ensuring that a portion of that investment be made in the affordable neighborhoods that are identified. That it really would establish a policy safety net, ensuring that public taxpayer dollars will help those communities long into the future. And finally, to think about in the outcomes and reporting section, how county council can make sure to really know what metrics are being used and how reporting comes back to this council to make sure that community partners are being heard, that the partnership with the land bank is strong so that it can continue on that way, and that a framework for future administrations and councils can build upon this legislation. We appreciate the opportunity to testify today and look forward to working with council leadership on the proposed legislation. Thanks very much.
Mr. Ford?
Chairman Jones, members of council, my name is Frank Ford. I'm with Western Reserve Land Conservancy. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the proposed county housing program. I join with others in thanking the council for proposing the county's first ever housing program and for selecting the county land bank to play a lead role in the program. I have 3 comments which are laid out in more detail in written testimony I've submitted. My first concern is that the proposed housing program only addresses 2 of the 6 objectives in the county's housing plan. There's nothing in the legislation that addresses the recommendations in the plan with respect to fair housing, housing insecurity, housing needs for special populations, or property tax delinquency. My recommendation echoes the recommendation of others today, amend the homeowner assistance section to give the Department of Development flexibility to provide other assistance for those other areas. The source of funding should be the Community Development Fund and the General Fund, not the Land Bank's existing reserves or DTAC funding. My second concern is the lack of a specific allocation for affordable housing. The overwhelming majority of the housing issues the housing program will address are located in the 22 municipal school districts that meet the affordable definition, meaning a single-family home value of $117,000 or less. Yet there is no requirement that any portion of the housing program funds be spent in these municipalities. My recommendation is to amend Section 80903B to require that a fixed percentage of funding for the home renovation and housing market components be invested in affordable neighborhoods. My third concern is that the job of the $50 million demolition fund to restore housing markets damaged by the foreclosure crisis is substantially unfinished. When the fund was created, 80% of the homes requiring demolition were in the city of Cleveland. Today, with more than $40 million allocated, only 43% of the fund has benefited the city of Cleveland. Meanwhile, the suburbs, which comprised only 20% of the problem, received 57% of the funding. Because of this unequal distribution of funding, there are still 5,500 homes needing demolition, most of which are in predominantly African-American communities in Cleveland and East Cleveland. Let me be clear, I am not recommending that you allocate more funding for demolition, but there are 3 things this council could do that could help finish the job on the east side of Cleveland and in East Cleveland. First, amend the annual reporting requirement, which I believe another speaker just mentioned, to require the Land Bank and the Department of Development to specifically report in its report the estimate of remaining demolition that's needed. Blight undermines the success of housing renovation. If we're going to pivot to rehab, we should know what is the extent of the blight existing that's going to undermine the rehab efforts, and where is that? Second, amend the original demolition program. This probably isn't popular. Oh, and it's not popular. Should I stop, or may I have the indulgence?
Finish your point,
Yes. Second, amend the original demolition program to ensure that the remaining $8 to $9 million in demolition funding more equitably meets the unmet housing stabilization needs in Cleveland and the city of East Cleveland. This can be done by 1, raising the current $2 million maximum on any one award, or 2, by extending the program deadline to ensure that these cities receive an equitable distribution of funds. Thank you for indulging me to finish that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Martin?
Good morning. My name is Sally Martin. I'm the Housing Director for the City of South Euclid. On behalf of Mayor Georgine Wheelo and the City of South Euclid, we'd like to recognize and applaud your leadership in proposing the establishment of a county housing program through the introduction of this legislation. The City of South Euclid is represented on the Cuyahoga County Housing Stakeholders Group, the First Suburbs Coalition, the Vacant Abandoned Property Action Council, and the Greater Cleveland Reinvestment Coalition. Through our involvement with these policy advocacy groups, we have a keen understanding of housing needs throughout the region, not just in our own backyard. It's from this perspective that we submit our testimony. While what is being proposed is a good start at operationalizing the county's housing plan, it should serve as a starting point for a truly comprehensive housing policy. Of the 6 critical focus areas identified in the county's housing plan, the proposed legislation meets 2. In an environment of limited resources, it's understandable that all identified needs may not be able to be met at once. However, we urge the county to continue its work with the stakeholders to seek ways to move the entire housing plan forward. In the spirit of making the proposed legislation as effective as possible, it is our suggestion that the following modifications be made. Commit to enhancing and expanding the CDSG grant program. A $1 million expansion was proposed to County Council by the Housing Stakeholders Group and would provide much-needed flexible funding for cities and nonprofits to continue to innovate and address specific community needs. As a critical component of the county's housing program, the CDSG grant program should be identified in the legislation and extended to 2025 to match the duration of the proposed legislation. Ensure that 90% of the funds for rehab and new construction are spent in communities that have had 20% or more of their housing stock in foreclosure and have not yet recovered their peak housing value. This will ensure that the efforts made will have an impact in the hardest hit areas of the county. Work with cities and CDCs collaboratively to formulate a rehab strategy and define target areas. Consider amending the legislation to add the requirement of establishing an MOU between cities and the CCLRC to cement a strategy before beginning work in a community to ensure that activities are in line with community goals and objectives. Annual reporting metrics should be more clearly defined in the proposed legislation to provide a detailed overview of where program activities are occurring, as well as a snapshot of the overall health of the housing market by city and Cleveland neighborhood, including showing the number of vacant, condemned, tax delinquent, mortgage foreclosed units. Require an annual housing sales trend and bank lending study to show which financial institutions are working effectively to meet credit needs in greater Cleveland neighborhoods and which are not. Leverage the influence of the county to hold lenders accountable to develop legislation to only deposit county funds in financial institutions that are investing in the community. Consider working with local researchers and universities to create a consistent set of annual metrics as a report back to the community. As you're aware, Mayor Wheelo has provided 3 pages of detailed feedback which has been placed on the record. Our city stands ready to assist the county in any way needed to move toward the implementation of a comprehensive countywide housing policy. Thank you.
Ms. Anthony?
Good morning, Council President Brady, Community Development Committee Chair, Councilman Jones, and all members of council present this morning. My name is Erica Anthony. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations and Strategy for Cleveland Neighborhood Progress. Cleveland Neighborhood Progress would like to thank County Council for your leadership in addressing the growing and urgent needs in our community. As a member of the County Housing Stakeholder Group, we have worked for years alongside a diverse set of interests and constituencies to achieve one goal: creating and advancing an equitably resourced and comprehensive approach to housing for Cuyahoga County residents. This comprehensive approach, detailed in the ordinance, underscores the importance of a long-term, dedicated, and flexible county housing fund that has been shared with some of the folks this morning. We urge County Council to consider this legislation as an opportunity to establish such a fund. A flexible county housing fund could help the priorities you have already identified in the legislation, such as home repair assistance and small dollar mortgages. However, incorporating the flexibility in a framework for council to adopt other future needs is essential to ensure nimbleness to the market and various needs of our communities. Future needs may include items such as prioritizing financial capability of residents through one-on-one financial coaching and planning, acquisition rehabilitation lines of credit, and particular attention to special populations such as low and moderate income renters who are housing insecure, families with young children needing to move out of housing with lead hazards, and individuals reentering our community from the criminal justice system. Beyond the idea of a flexible county housing fund, we would like to reiterate that the proposed legislation is a dramatic step in the right direction. Based on our experience in the community, we urge County Council to consider 3 small amendments to ensure that the county housings program has long-term success as well as broader community assistance. As stated this morning by some of my colleagues, under the homeowner assistance, we urge County Council to include emergency and short-term rental assistance to address the county's growing crisis with housing insecurity. The addition of this program element will support low and moderate income families by maintaining stable housing and prevention of evictions. Under the program administration, we urge County Council to ensure that a portion of investment be made in affordable neighborhoods. Dedicating a portion of investment in affordable neighborhoods as opposed to solely looking at middle market or high market neighborhoods means that there is a policy safety net to ensure that the public taxpayer dollars will help those communities most in need in long to the future. Finally, under the outcomes and reporting section, we urge County Council to consider including long-term guardrails for community support, the inclusion of language that outlines coordination with advocates, reporting on consistent set of metrics, and the opportunity for regular program reviews, ensure that this county housing program will serve as a framework that future administration and council can build upon long into the future. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and look forward to working with council leadership on the proposed legislation. Thank you for your time.
Ms. Diana C.
Good morning, Chairman Jones and committee members. I am Diana Sagatovich. That's what the C stands for. Executive Director of Cogswell Hall, a low-income housing alternative for single adults with disabling conditions that has served Greater Cleveland for 140 years. I thank you for this opportunity to address you today regarding the ordinance that will create the county housing program. Cogswell Hall has been a member of the County Housing Stakeholder Group since its inception, and I have had the privilege of working with a dedicated and diverse group of stakeholders, some of whom you're hearing from today, toward the goal of creating a more equitable and comprehensive approach to housing within Cuyahoga County. I've also been the member of your Office of Homeless Services Advisory Board, serving in that capacity from 2002 to 2007. At Cogswell Hall, we are both a property owner and a service provider. Therefore, I have the unusual privilege of seeing many sides of the issue around affordable housing, persons with special needs, seniors, individuals struggling with the effects of homelessness. I understand a property owner need to have rents paid timely and in full. I also understand the barriers of low-income renters that they face with consistent housing payments. I applaud and thank you, Cuyahoga Council members, for taking the steps toward addressing the growing and urgent housing needs in our community. I appreciate your recognition of the county housing plan, the 6 housing issue areas, and the need for flexibility in a housing program. The comprehensive approach of the county housing plan underscored this need of flexibility in a county housing fund that includes assistance for both homeownership and renters. This legislation, as opposed, addresses homeowners. It leaves a very large gap by not addressing any of the housing insecurity for renters, many of whom are low-wage working families, seniors, people with disabling conditions, veterans, returning citizens, youth aging out of foster care, and other special populations. Over 40% of the residents in Cuyahoga County rent, over 60% of African American households, almost 57% of Latina households, and just under 48% of Asian households rent, while only just over 25% of white households rent. Although a step forward for homeowners in the county, as this legislation stands, it is not equitable nor is it comprehensive as needed. Addressing renter households who are housing insecure could be included in the registration by amending the language in section 809.2B2 from homeowners assistance to residents assistance and adding language, as some of my colleagues have said, to include renters. A section C, rental assistance, deposits, and eviction prevention could be part of a flexible housing fund to extend to a variety of needs. I would also join my colleagues in urging you to ensure portion of investment in housing development and rehabilitation be targeted to affordable neighborhoods as opposed to middle market and high market neighborhoods. Coordination with advocates, consistent metrics for reporting, periodic reviews as addition to outcomes and reporting can enhance the program's accountability and set a framework for the future. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Mr. Starr?
Morning, Chairman Jones, a member of the Community Development Committee. My name is Phil Starr, and I am the chair of the Cuyahoga Affordable Housing Alliance, and I am a member of the County Stakeholders Group. In 2014, Ordinance 2014-04, Council states its intent to adopt a comprehensive housing policy. It is time for such a policy, and unfortunately, the current legislation does not achieve that intent. In several places in this legislation, there's a reference to housing insecurity, but I am here today because of my concern that in developing a housing program that will guide the county for the next 5 years, there's no reference to any activities or goals for the county to address housing insecurity or the housing needs of the special needs population. The county housing plan identifies 96,000 low-income households that are housing insecure, paying 50% or more of their income for housing costs. The rent burden often forces these families into homelessness or adds additional burdens on health and human services. I have a few suggestions. One, as many others have said, provide greater flexibility in the use of the homeowner assistance component to be a housing assistance component that can be used to develop pilot programs to test approaches for assistance as needs are identified and change over time. At least doubling the allocation from the Community Development Fund of casino revenue would increase the opportunity for such innovation. Two, incorporate in the legislation the requirement that by the end of 2019, County Council, the administration, and housing stakeholders will identify and quantify the most significant housing insecurity needs and develop a set of goals and what the costs would be. Number three, develop a 5-year plan based on the established goals and that identifies specific steps to be taken on ways to achieve the goal, including specific objectives and outcomes. 4, address lead poisoning in a more proactive manner. Require that all county health and human services programs and any housing programs that the county provides financial support, including the land bank housing rehabilitation efforts, will be required to be lead safe. 5, fund a county housing fund with ongoing dedicated funding sources that will be available over time to address critical housing needs. Franklin County has established a housing trust fund to address homelessness and housing insecurity. It is funded using some of the real estate conveyance fee and bed tax. If Cuyahoga County dedicated $1 million out of its 4, that would generate at least $4 million based on 2016 data, and 10% of the bed tax would be $2.4 million. There would be an annual allocation of over $6 million. As the property recovery efforts that are funded by this legislation increase the value of properties, the conveyance fee should also go up, increasing that fund. 6, increase the information required in Section 809.04C in the joint annual report to include information on the home repair needs, number of condemned properties by jurisdiction, number of homeless and rent-burdened families, evictions, and special needs populations, so we have a sense of where we are and where we're going. And last, 7, create an internal housing task force comprised of the directors of all county departments that allocate any funds for housing, along with the Adams Board, to meet on a regular basis to review program activities to determine if coordination of efforts could better utilize existing resources. Thank you very much for your time.
Ms. Kuzma?
Good morning, Committee Chair Jones, County Council President Brady, and esteemed members of County Council. Nice to see you for your first time in this role. As many of you know, First Suburbs is a council of government that represents 19 communities here in Cuyahoga County, 37% of our total population. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you. The County Council's commitment to address housing needs in Cuyahoga County and taking this next step to advance rehabilitation is a very important one. First Suburbs is a proud member of the County Housing Stakeholders Group. Previously committed county council funds have allowed for over 1,200 structures to come down in the inner ring communities, representing nearly half of the funds that have been allocated. While we know residential demos will still be needed, they will come at a much slower pace. Your nationally recognized CDSG program has allowed communities to start municipal rehab programs, storefront rehab programs, and has brought beautification to municipal parks and other properties. We're patiently awaiting the announcement of 19 funds. I'd like to plant the seed for an additional residential CDSG program, which could allow communities to undertake innovative approaches to save threatened housing and neighborhoods. As currently drafted, the county housing program allows more communities to access funds that would otherwise not be available to them. This switch to rehab will allow municipalities to address those structures that the private market has not shown interest in, and to address residential areas before they tip to a point of no return, as former FSC Chair Mayor Summers often suggests, using one stitch in time to save 9. It will also allow our communities to work with previous partners like the much respected County Land Bank and County Department of Development's Community Development Office, who have successfully collaborated and have a well-proven track record to help our municipalities. A commitment of these county funds also allows us to open the door to leverage bank and possible philanthropic funds to look at the other needs in the housing policy. We thank you for your commitment to housing in Cuyahoga County. Without strong housing, Cuyahoga County cannot be a place to thrive together. Thank you.
Mr. Welly?
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Welly. Thank you for the chance to address you this morning.
What's your name?
Jonathan Welly. I grew up in the suburbs of Cuyahoga County and just a few months ago moved to Detroit Shoreway. And while I'm very happy to be part of the redevelopment that's happening within the city, I recognize also that as a white guy with a college degree moving into Detroit Shoreway, I am in some ways the face of gentrification. And I'm distressed to think that the redevelopment in Cleveland inevitably means displacement, and that my presence and presence of people with backgrounds like me in Detroit Shoreway and other prosperous neighborhoods in the city or up-and-coming neighborhoods in the city will inevitably lead to rising rents and the displacement of poor people and working class people and Black people and other people of color who are longtime residents of Detroit Shoreway. And the only way that redevelopment and people like me moving in the city can happen without that displacement is if the county and the city has a comprehensive housing policy that puts equity first. And I commend the county towards taking those steps in the housing plan that they've put forward in the past. It's not clear to me, however, that the ordinance in front of us, 2019-01, takes all the appropriate steps to promote that type of equity. And I have a few suggestions on the principles that I hope that the county keeps in mind as you all continue to deliberate on this bill. The first is in transparency, particularly in how this bill is processed and passed. The bill has been public for just a few weeks, and I appreciate the chance to speak today. And I think today we've heard some wonderful comments from community groups. But given that housing is such a personal and central issue to how we live in Cuyahoga County, I think it's important that there is an extensive public input process for a bill such as this. The second is in accountability, and first relating to accountability in terms of partner agencies. It's not clear to me exactly why the county would want to cede control over such an important issue to a third party. And if the county does choose to do so, I think we've heard today some really compelling metrics that will be important for the county to understand in order to have true accountability in this process as the county monitors and evaluates the way in which this program is put into operation. And finally, when it comes to accountability, I think it's especially important, as others have suggested before me, that the county have an appropriate mechanism for ensuring that the third party, in this case the land bank, partner in an appropriate way with local leaders, municipal leaders, CDC leaders, and that includes both folks involved with formal organizations as well as informal organizations. And I'd be excited to see a version of this legislation that includes a more explicit definition of how the county will make sure that the land bank is doing that in an appropriate way. Thank you for your time.
Ms. Bowman?
Good morning, members of council. I'm Gretchen Bowman, the Acting Executive Director of Neighborhood Housing Services of Greater Cleveland. Many speakers this morning have made reference to the county's housing stakeholders group, and I've had the opportunity to serve as team captain of the Access to Capital portion of that committee. I'm here to express my support for the ordinance under discussion this morning. From my reading of the legislation, it is clear to me that this body heard the recommendation and priorities of the County Housing Stakeholders Group and made efforts to create a framework to address those recommendations. I thank you for your attention to those concerns. With regard to access to capital, this legislation creates a program to extend mortgages under $50,000, thereby increasing supply of a product much in demand in many of your districts, but as of now not widely available in the private marketplace. I also appreciate that the structure of this legislation allows for the county's Department of Development to create programming and put that programming out through the county's RFP process. This is likely to generate innovation with regard to home repair and other lending programs by allowing a competition of the best ideas to come forward. Similarly, as this legislation allows for some discretion on the part of the Department of Development, that department will be better placed to respond to 2021's major concerns as opposed to responding to the concerns that we believe now will be at the forefront in 2021. This legislation also importantly allows for the extension of the work of the County Land Bank, which has proven itself to be a major and innovative driver of community development in our county. Finally, I'd like to thank the council for what this legislation represents: an ongoing commitment to funding housing and housing rehabilitation throughout the county. I believe that this legislation also offers a framework for growth, the flexibility of which could be increased to allow the county to be in a position to collaborate with municipalities to be responsive to future housing challenges and better address the needs of the county's most vulnerable populations, including senior citizens, low-income renters, and the disabled. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Mr. Hansler?
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Steve Hansler. I'm the president of Maximum Accessible Housing of Ohio, MAHO for short. We're a local nonprofit that provides accessible housing for people with mobility disabilities, and we promote accessibility and aging in place through education, information, and advocacy. I applaud County Council and this committee for addressing housing needs through this proposed county housing program. As the details of this program are developed, I encourage you to keep three needs in mind. First, aging in place. As you are undoubtedly aware, Cuyahoga County, like the rest of the country, is facing a silver tsunami of aging baby boomers, of which I'm one, and many of whom would like to age in place. 22% of Cuyahoga County residents are over age 60, and 32% of them have a disability. A housing program that provides seniors with technical assistance and resources that will allow them to remain in their homes will help stabilize housing markets and increase quality of life for many residents. Number two, aging in community. There are also many seniors who want to downsize or whose housing cannot easily be adapted. Quite often, they would want to remain in the community where they currently live and have connections. For them, there need to be appropriate housing options. This can be done by making sure that wherever possible, any housing that is renovated is done so that someone can age well. That means things like first floor bedrooms and bathrooms. Number three, accessibility and universal design. There is a severe shortage of accessible housing in Cuyahoga County. Our accessible apartments have 3 to 5 year waiting lists. 14% of Cuyahoga County residents have a disability. Any new housing developed or renovated as part of this county housing program should have an appropriate percentage of units that are fully accessible and an additional percentage that are designed to be adaptable. Those percentages need to be included in the legislation to make sure that they happen. As I understand the outline of the proposed county housing program, all three of these needs can be easily addressed within the context. Meeting these needs do not require a special program. Instead, clear guidance in the legislation and attention to detail as regulations are developed will ensure that seniors and people with disabilities are served by this new housing program.
Maximum Accessible Housing of Ohio looks forward to working with County Council, county staff, and other stakeholders in developing this program. Thank you for your time.
And lastly, Ms. Lou.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Well, after we hear all the professional people, now it comes to the undesirable, immature person. Now, the housing issue has been a long time in this county. I would say at least 3 decades, at least. However, I would really support county council after you have Ms. Simon's environmental efforts on protecting Lake Erie water, our drinking water, after Mr. Brady put up a good legislation to protect consumers' rights, especially from auto dealership and others. Now, we also have another good one, anti-discrimination county ordinance, to pave the way for the future also. So now, here comes this one, housing. This one could be a real solution for all the multiple troubles we have got for decades. However, the current plan, it seems like it went to a different direction. We already have a local CDCs putting desirable people in certain communities. Because of the economy I mentioned last time, our good neighborhoods has been shrunk down to very limited few. All others became undesirable communities with a higher crime rate. RTA bus don't even put up many buses for frequent trips for people. This will be a chance. We actually can improve lots of different things all at the same time. You can actually make the undesirable people becoming desired, and also motivate RTA to put on better service. In this case, not only you restore the working power or the resources from within, you can also attract people from outside. Because if we can do it, more than Cuyahoga River catching on fire on its own, we can do more. Please think about one thing. This is also the conversation I had with Mr. Jones. This particular first phase, 5 or 6 years, we should not focus on market rates, because now we have a way more undesirable neighborhood people are afraid of going to. So if you don't worry about that, let the price drop down. This will be the chance for County Land Bank to attract affordable housing developers. One of them right now today, for example, Maximum Housing, and there are others. For them to build up way more than before as the real multifamily mixed income housing. In that case, we will have a way more housing to house people, make them stable around the school, around the healthcare centers. In that case, people can improve their situation. Their kids can be in school late in a good way. They can improve their health. That will be really the starting point to restore our good neighborhoods. This will be a good step for our county. I wish you keep on going. We support you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Liu. Ashley, has anyone else signed in for public comment?
No, Mr. Chair, no one else has signed in.
At this moment, I'll entertain a motion to approve our minutes from the January 14th meeting. Moved and seconded. All in favor say aye. Aye. Ayes have it. At this time, Ashley, if you would read our ordinance into the record.
Ordinance number 2019-0001, enacting Chapter 809 and amending Section 704.01 of the Cuyahoga County Code to establish the Cuyahoga County Housing Program.
All right. We have someone to speak to this matter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Michael King, council staff. So this is the second committee in which this ordinance been read. We gave a pretty in-depth overview last time. We're here. I know there are a couple of proposed amendments that have been drafted for today. I'm here to answer any questions that may be outstanding at this point, but other than that, interested.
Okay. Well, at this time, we do have 2 amendments. Our amendment number 1 was sponsored by Councilmember Sonny Simon. And I'll take a moment and I'll simply read the summary. It says this amendment, one, adds demolition as an eligible program expense beginning in 2021, and second, provides that the land bank will not undertake particular program activities in conflict with the expressed wishes of any municipality or township in which it operates. And at this moment, I'm going to open it up to questions from the committee. Councilwoman Simon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to give some insight as to why I thought this amendment would be important to this legislation. First of all, you know, with getting feedback from communities and what they would like to see, I thought this was an innocuous way to balance out the county's interests, the land bank's interests as an arm of the county, and the needs of the community when going forward with housing. First of all, demolition. I mean, I think that's clear that we're relying on hardest hit funds to be able to continue with demo programs through the next couple years, but that's going to dry up. And demolition at no point, I don't think in the near future, is entirely going to dry up. So communities needed some flexibility if they had a house or two that's remnant to come down, to have the ability to have that come down. I just don't see demolition, and nor does the housing stakeholders think that that's going to go away anytime soon. So this just provides after 2021 that there'll be some funds available for demo. The second issue is the communities. Many communities have strategic plans. They have vision for their communities. They're on the ground. They understand what needs to happen where. And they need to, I believe, have a say in whether a property gets demoed, whether a property gets rehabbed, or what would make sense where. Now, what I've been hearing from testimony over the past couple of years is that the land bank works with communities about how to proceed in those particular communities. I think it's important that that this is contained in legislation, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future with land bank leadership. It's been cooperative to date, but in the next 10 years, 5 years, well, the length of this, I think it's really important that communities are engaged in, and they know best, I believe, in their particular streets and neighborhoods what makes sense. But this certainly does not compel the land bank to do anything. This doesn't, the communities do not have the right to tell the land bank what to do. It just gives the cities a chance to say what not to do, that it makes more sense to maybe demo than to have a property rehab. So it just codifies what the cooperation is that's been happening, but this certainly strikes a balance in allowing communities to say, not, we don't want this, but cannot dictate to the land bank what to do. And that was a discussion over some time about what that balance should be. And I think it's important when the county council gives the land bank our funds, our taxpayer money, to an entity that's not accountable, it's a statutory entity, that the accountability not only rests with this council when we get our reports, but also that there be some accountability to the communities that we represent. And this doesn't give some too much authority to the communities, but it gives them a say. And, you know, hearing about an MOU about strategic planning from the land bank might make more sense. But for now, I thought this was a minimal way to strike this delicate balance. Thank you.
Chairman, thank you very much. As the sponsor of the legislation, I consider this amendment to be a friendly amendment. I agree that there will always be a need for a demolition component to what we do. After all, we're continuing a different phase of what we've been doing for the last 4 years. I think it's completely reasonable that a community be able to decline a project of demolition or rehab if they so desire, because they have a good reason. And that seems like a fair proposal to me. So I see this amendment as a friendly amendment that I'm supporting, and I'd just like to say that in terms of a lot of the comments that have been made earlier. We've heard a lot of this for a long time, and we've had individual meetings with a lot of folks, and a lot of us agree with most of what we hear today. We have known that since we began to try to put this legislation together. This legislation doesn't attempt to try to do everything. And I don't believe that we'll be successful if the legislation does try to attempt to do everything. I don't think we should let as the cliche goes, let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Now, we can build on this and we can build toward these issues, but I have to say, quite honestly, I never designed this legislation as economic justice legislation or social justice legislation. I know that many of the people in this room have dedicated many years of their lives to fair housing legislation, and that is their focus, and I do support their efforts. I'm trying to do what I think is a practical, significant step in the stabilization and rehabilitation of housing in this community, continuing on the efforts that have been made over the years, and with the in cooperation and in tandem with the land bank that has been very successful over the last 8 to 9 years in their efforts. So we simply want to, given our opportunity here to be part of this effort that many people in this community have worked on for many years. And so I am determined that this legislation be narrowly focused and not take on social and economic justice issues as part of its part of this legislation. I'm also quite willing to entertain these discussions and debates around these issues and for future legislation at any time. But this legislation is not designed to do these things, and I don't believe that it can be that comprehensive, and I think we'll still be sitting here next year if we try to follow that path. So if the councilwoman, I know there's more discussion here, but when the councilwoman decides to move the legislation, the amendment, if she does, then I'll be glad to second that legislation.
Thank you, Council President. And I'll say this, as the primary sponsor of the $50 million demolition fund, we had similar pushback. Let's accomplish all the valuable things and noteworthy things that needed to be done. But we wanted to be impactful at that time. As the Council President has put forward this legislation, we're having the same conversations. Again, not that we don't support. There was a demand for rehab when we were demolishing, and we did not touch it at that time. And now there are certainly, again, qualified requests and demands at this moment. Again, things that we certainly believe in, but at this time we do want to move forward. So I do support this legislation. I do have questions around the amendment that I do want to discuss. And I'm asking, I would like the land bank, if Gus Frangos could come forward. And I just to have some of my concerns eased. Yes. And I will allow Councilwoman to ask a question before.
As Mr. Frangos and Mr. Schramm approach the podium, one of the things that I remember is that the original enabling legislation under the state of Ohio strongly encouraged and was pretty specific about the municipal jurisdictions within the county that any land bank was incorporated in be partners in how things moved forward. And I believe almost every community was offered the ability to enter into an MOU with the land bank when it first started. And I don't think that their policies have changed on that. Is that correct from the chairman to Mr. Frangos?
Mr. Chairman, to Councilman Stevens, we do, from the beginning, we had an invitation for cities to establish MOUs. They were broad parameters. They were around acquisition, demolition, disposition. And so it was a balance. It was an attempt to try to just do a little bit of what Councilwoman Simon was saying. Either party could navigate outside of that if it didn't make sense. But the intention was, and it remains, we still have MOUs with a handful of cities that would provide some guideposts. If a city said particularly, we absolutely don't want you to do this, you know, we would embrace that in the form of an MOU. I always say that we need flexibility though, because there are some times when you just on the ground, whether it's an insurance question or whether it's a legal issue, sometimes you have to have that flexibility. But in principle, I think our willingness to do that is what, at least from my perspective, has kept a good relationship with virtually all of the municipalities. Most of the municipalities, as I said, don't have MOUs because it's just kind of worked out. It's worked out that way. As a practical matter, it has to work out that way. Otherwise, you know, you won't have the goodwill of the communities. But yes, Ms. Stephen, it's a long-winded answer to yes.
Okay. So Gus, my question is, again, I represent a depressed district, hopefully it becoming an emerging district with your help. My question is, if particular projects come forward, do you see any concern around the CDC's using this amendment to simply block any effort that you might seek to any projects you might seek to work? And how do you see that dynamic in relationship?
I generally don't, especially if you assume goodwill across the board. Number one, the legislation, as I understand it, applies to municipalities, providing that veto power. But as a practical matter, when we go into a neighborhood and we want to rehab something, it's usually a good thing, you know, from everybody's standpoint. And there are times when some folks and even council people say, no, absolutely, we don't want that to be rehabbed. It needs to be demolished. And then we either work that out, or we make an adjustment, or we demolish it, or we don't acquire it at the front end. But I just don't see that. I think for CDC to go to a municipal official and to say, don't do what we all know to be a good thing, would be rare. There would have to be some really particular reason, and we'd have to work it out. But I don't see that. In 10 years, I'm just going from my practice, we have not had that problem.
And it's one that could be talked out if as you described it, a rare instance, if it were to happen, conversation could be had.
Yes, and if usually it shakes out, because if somebody has a illicit motive in doing that, it'll stick out like a thumb. I mean, the community looks at it, the CDCs participate. The good carries a certain light to it that will shine, and if somebody wants to snuff that out, it'll stick out like a sore thumb. But that's why I can say in the 10 years we've been doing this, maybe once or twice something like that has happened, and there's usually a reason though, and we typically yield because it's just a sensible thing to do. We have to stay in partnership with folks.
And I'll say this, as I've expressed the one concern, what makes me lean toward the legislation is I have talked with mayors, those who've had concerns around home ownership and having a healthy balance of home ownership to renting, and that might come from rehabbing, finding that healthy balance. And I've certainly worked with the mayors that I've represented in seeing that they reach that. So I get where Councilwoman Simon's legislation is coming from, because I've had those same conversations. I've had it with cities who were concerned with, can we make those type of mortgages? Can we get those homeowners? And when we lose that renter balance, we've seen that same challenge in East Cleveland in the early 70s, and inability to get those type of, maintain that healthy balance. And we know where the challenges that they're facing 40 years later. So I get that. And that's what makes me lean towards that, towards the amendment. So when I thank you for that comment.
Yeah, we would have no objection to that amendment. It's, as the councilwoman said, it's benign enough to make sure that protection's in place, but ultimately not to unduly tie the land bank's hands. And I think it's a sensible.
I have another question.
Yes.
The D says no more than 4 units. Sonny, was there a reason for the 4 units?
I'm looking at the amendment. Where do you see 4 units?
Letter D.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The land bank may conduct strategic demolitions. of
Oh, with the
residential
demo. I'm
structures
sorry. I
with-
thought you were still on E. No, I thought you were talking about E. Just because of the, go ahead, Mike. You
Yeah,
can-
just as a matter of drafting, we had to specify, since again, this is a housing program, the demolition program, as it currently exists, is not restricted to residential, but as a housing program, we wanted to put some parameters around what the eligible demolition would be. And I believe the 1 to 4 unit is a hardest hit fund restriction, and so we were just looking to mirror something reasonable in terms of.
But in some communities, there are 8 to 12 unit buildings, for example. In one of my communities, there are some substantially larger than 4 unit apartment buildings that need to come down, and specifically in East Cleveland. And if you tailor this to 4 units, then that leaves one specific neighborhood where there's plenty of work to be done, as something that you won't be capable of doing this with this fund.
The one, I'll turn it over to Gus because I think he can provide some response as well. But one thing in terms of the number of units, as you well know, and probably know better than I would, but I'll defer to Gus on this. The costs associated with bringing down larger unit structures escalates pretty quickly. And given this is a program that has about $5 million a year and is principally about rehab and renovation, we wanted to make through Councilwoman Simon, demolition an eligible expense, knowing that there was still going to be need out there, but with an understanding that there are limited resources here. So I'll defer it to Gus on.
I think it might be a good balance to keep that portion in, because we don't want to use the program dollars per se to just start doing demolition and completely lose sight of the rehabilitation, the housing component of this. But the way I read this legislation, and you can all correct me if I'm wrong, that would be just the actual program dollars and the profits from sales that are considered program dollars. The recoupment of investments that we make, or if we sell something in forfeiture, or if we bring dollars that are not directly the program dollars, we can still use those pretty much any way that we have been using them. So
I'd rather see a dollar amount here than a unit number, because a dollar amount would allow the municipality to make a decision about how they recommended that the county partner with them, and they could kick in, for example, $100,000 toward a larger demo, and then the city could put in the balance or find it from another fund.
I'm not sure about putting inflexible amount of dollars in here. I have to leave it up to
4 units is inflexible.
Up to 4 units?
Yeah. So if it's an 8 unit building, they can't do anything with it.
Well, it's a balance. I mean, we can talk about that, I guess, and bring this, I'd like to get this amendment moved to have this amendment passed as part of this adopted, and then we can talk about whether there'll be any further amendments. I'm going to make a motion, and then I don't have the expertise or dollar amounts at this point as we sit here if we're going to start putting inflexible caps on things.
Well,
and if it needs to be 8 units or 7 or 6, I don't know the answer to that.
And I would tell you that since I do have practical experience here, that a dollar amount is a better way to match.
Okay, so
rather than
I'm
a
willing
unit
to
number.
look at that, but at this point, I'd like to move the amendment.
Yes, just like a few words. I understand what Councilwoman Stevens is saying. What this partly follows is our recognition as we got into the demolition program that we would very quickly use up all of our demolition money if we didn't have some restrictions on commercial demolition. We would literally be out of money, and there's no more money. I mean, I guess we all need to say this one more time. There's not unlimited amount of money. We've been able to find some money, and we've been able to find some money that doesn't impact on the general fund, and it's limited. And so we have to look at it that way. Whether the councilwoman has a specific point is debatable, is a relevant point. But the councilwoman is going to have to come up with her own amendment, and working with all of us, if she feels strongly enough on this issue. Meanwhile, I'll be supporting this amendment until I see the actual details of any other amendment.
Again, just for clarification, this amendment, the way I'm reading the legislation, doesn't prohibit us from doing a commercial demolition or something that's outside the four-family, if it's recouped dollars or dollars that, for example, if we sell a factory or something for, at North Randall, and we bring in a certain income that's not DTAC based, it doesn't prohibit us from using that money if we feel that it's worthy or necessary. So from our standpoint, we're okay with either, however it comes out, but unless I'm wrong, I think we have the capability to do both.
Well, I would suggest that after this amendment hopefully passes and has the support of this committee, that we take another look at that particular issue that the councilwoman has brought up and see if there's some way we can further tweak this legislation that would satisfy the councilperson's concern and reflect her expertise.
We would welcome that. At least to that extent, it makes a statement that four-family stuff outside the four-family is also something contemplated. So either way, we would have no objection from where we're sitting.
Any further discussion? At this moment, Councilwoman Simon has made a motion.
Second.
Amendment.
Regarding the amendment, again, any further discussion? If not, we have a first and a second. All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Aye. Opposed.
Okay, and one opposition. The amendment has passed. We have a second amendment. In fact, Ashley, why don't you read that second amendment into the record? Let me read. They've given it to me. And this is a summary. The amendment modifies the program funding in the years 2020 and 2021, and also 2022, to shift an aggregate of $2.5 million in program funding from the general fund to the community development fund. This is amending sections 809.05A to read as follows: additions, underlined, deletion is stricken. And again, section 809.05 of program funding. So again, this adjusts where the monies are coming from for the housing fund.
Mr. Chairman.
And if you'd like to speak to it.
Yes, thank you very much. When we were initially looking at this legislation last fall, we had considered legislation that would, we had considered funding the legislation strictly through community development funds without any general funds. As the dialogue continued, it was believed that a balance of general funds and community development funds would be better. Some things have come up since then, and most importantly, the dour need for immediate funding and for COs in the jail will require us to dip into the reserve of the general fund. And so for that reason, for the most part, I believe that we should support an amendment that relies entirely on the community development funds, known as casino funds, because they are flexible and they are available. We were approached by Councilman Baker and Councilman Miller about their concerns very recently, and since they're not on the committee, I've agreed to forward this amendment, which I believe is the correct way to go at this time in particular. Just for a little background, this does not take place. This does not start to draw down on any funding until 2020. Our community development funds will be able to recoup enough to backfill funds that we would have lost in this change, and I think it will be easy to be able to demonstrate that there will be enough community development funds for the project and needs that the council members pursue. But I think at this time, with the heavy pressure on the general funds and the absolute emergency need to dip into the general fund reserve, that I would like to move to use only community development funds for this program. And is there anything, Mike, that you have to add to that? Or
thank you, Mr. Brady. The only thing I would also note is just a reminder from the presentation last time that the impact on the county's budget is really is most impactful in the first few years of the program. In the last 3 years of the program, 80% of the funds are actually DTAC funds. These are land bank programs. The county's contribution is about $1 million in those years, the out years. In the nearer term, the county contributes more to the program, and the reason for that is because the land bank still needs their DTAC money to wind down their demolition activities, or at least complete the demolition commitments that have been made thus far through both the county and the hardest hit funding. So these dollars are in some ways transitional, and that the hope is in the out years that we're going to be able to continue this using principally DTAC revenue. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Any questions from the committee? Councilman Miller.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I would like to just speak further in support of this amendment. The general fund is facing very serious challenges. We all know that we recently have elevated the need to provide several $1 million, which would be an annual ongoing commitment in additional funding for corrections officers for the jail issue. In addition to that, we all know that the county has not yet resolved the structural problem that was created by the state and federal policy change removing Medicaid sales tax as a source of revenue for the county, which caused a $27 million annual hole in our budget. And we've been patching that together with the aid of the transitional assistance that the state has provided, but that transitional assistance is going to run out in the next year or two. So in addition to that, the Health and Human Services Levy Fund is $15 to $20 million short on revenues versus expenditures on an annual basis, and the way that affects us is with the general fund is that there may come a time in the next couple of years of there being a need to shift some costs from the HHS levy fund to the general fund. So when you consider all of these things, I believe that it's important that we not use the general fund for this purpose in the short run. I hope that as the housing program expands over the years that there will come a time when we can allocate general fund money. But I think now is not that time, and that there's sufficient funds in the casino revenue fund to support the program as presented in the amendment. Thank you.
Any further discussion from committee? Again, I support this amendment as well in light of our challenges with the county jail and the efforts we've already made with our general funds towards these challenges, keeping it fluid and stepping away from our general fund for the moment, redirecting these dollars as we're doing in this amendment. I think it keeps in light with our overall efforts across the county to deal with many challenges. So again, I do support this amendment. If there are no further questions, I'll make would someone like to make a motion regarding this amendment?
I'd like to move the amendment.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. All right, thank you. So we've addressed two amendments. In fact, this time we'll open up if there are any general questions around the legislation itself. Councilwoman Conwell.
And I guess the individuals that need to probably answer would be Ken Surratt, Ms. Sarah Parks Jackson, and the Land Bank. I know it's very important for me especially to have the conversations with the community to make sure that they're a part of this housing program, especially since it's in their cities. But since the legislation kind of points out two different areas, the Land Bank will be handling one portion of it and community development will be handling another part. I would like to see or know, how do you plan on working together as a whole for this legislation, and how do you plan on bringing that reporting, what's going on with both of you?
It's going to have to be worked out. We don't know all the details, but the county development department and the land bank have certain unique capabilities for research and data. There's some stuff that I just don't think we're best equipped to get that the department is, and then there's data and the outcomes that we are good at, research on, land outcomes, land assemblages. I mean, the impact on a community, we can do some of that. So it just has to, we have worked real good with the development department over all these years, so I don't see any reason why that won't continue. But we're just going to have to do what we do best, and the county will do what they do best, and share information and report back to you.
Have you met and talked about what would be the frequency of you guys meeting? Communication is the big shortfall in this county. And now that you're an outside entity to some respects, and with us, we need to get all the information. So if you, as both groups, don't work and communicate on a regular basis of what's going on with the different sections of the housing program, how are we to expect to get that information? So I would like to see going forward that you guys are meeting on a regular basis, no matter what entity or role you're playing in the legislation, and whatever role they're playing, come together, and then when you report to us, that you also come together. So there will be always a consistency, and that we're hearing what's going on in terms of it. I agree with a lot of public comment this morning, and was going to work on some amendments myself, but the detailed metrics for every program, that would really come into play if you guys met on a regular basis about every aspect of this ordinance in a whole, so you can be able to bring that to us.
Mr. Chair, Madam Conwell, through Mr. Vice President, Chairman, we do meet pretty frequently as it is now, but I think your point is we need to make that more systematic, more, and again, the county is in an indirect way, direct, I would actually say, from the board standpoint. Mr. Surratt sits on our board, Chris Murray sits on our board, and then Mr. King sits on our board as well to oversee the activities that we do and to ultimately report back. So there's a healthy amount of discussion currently between Mr. Surratt and the department on the one hand and the land bank on the other. But your point is well taken. If we need to systematize that more for purposes of accurate and reliable reporting, then we'll do that.
Thank you. Can I hear from Mr. Surratt?
Sure. Ken Surratt from Department of Development. To the Councilwoman through the chair, I agree with Mr. Frangos. There are some structures already in place, particularly the Land Bank Board, where we do interact, but there are also, just in the current demolition program, many opportunities and touch points in which we do interact on a regular basis as well. I don't have any concerns about meeting and kind of aligning. I think that happens somewhat fluidly now, but I hear your concern or point, and agree that we can create some more formal touch points in terms of meeting as well as reporting.
Because it's really not a concern that you guys probably don't meet, because I know that you meet and you sit on various boards together. It's getting that information here to us. And so I think if you collectively do that, then we won't, this part didn't say this or this part didn't say that. We'll be able to get the whole picture of what's moving on. And in terms of the details for this housing program, there's a lot of areas that aren't detailed. Where are you at in that? I mean, if it's too broad, we can have a private conversation about it, but I need more detail in some areas of this ordinance before I'm.
Sure. To the Councilwoman, the portion that per the legislation would be under the I guess the design of the Department of Development is the Homeowner Assistance Program, which currently has two focus areas: the home repair assistance and the small dollar mortgage. Currently, I'm not sure if you're all aware, we have historically run a home repair program through our department for decades, and it's funded with our community development block grant, so our federal dollars. Actually, as we speak, there is an RFP out for a partner to work with us on that program. Actually, I think it aligns very well that while we have this federally funded program and home repair, and we expect those responses back this week, we can use those responses to help shape and complement the programming that comes out of this, and that's really our intention.
And what's your driving force? Is equity your driving force?
So there's many options. I think we left the RFP somewhat open as well, because we want to hear from the community and the providers in the community what they see as the needs and what their strengths are. I think some of the things that were brought up today in terms of accessibility for seniors and aging in their homes is definitely one that's brought up.
That's for the house. That's probably more for the repair program.
For the repair piece, correct.
But the actual housing assistant, because we all know across this county, we have market rate housing out the wazoo, but the other end is really hurting. And we need, for different levels, whether you're low income or just graduating from college, so we need housing in that area. And I've always said that, and since we're starting this, I want to really see a good portion of that availability in those two areas.
Right. And to the Councilwoman, I agree with you. I think the ability to get into affordable housing, I think actually this legislation perfectly helps create that opportunity where you can have the land bank using its power to create a pipeline, and where low-income borrowers who just need a small dollar can do the small dollar assistance program in coordination with the county. So I think that's the type of thing we'd like to really see, and to your point, and why we need to communicate is so that we really truly can leverage each other and the limited resources that have been put into.
And which banks have you had conversations with because I know there's a part of the legislation that actually talking about bundling some mortgages to be able to for banks to bite on this ordinance. So is there any specific banks that you've spoken to already that are willing partners in?
Currently, we have not. The plan is to do just that once this ordinance passes, and we'll have the details in place, or at least the framework in which to operate. And then, I definitely want to reach out to the banks, but I think there's some another RFP type opportunity to see who's a willing participant and also tried during those conversations as well to leverage those dollars as well, so we can expand on the dollars that council has committed to this.
And no banks have reached out, this big
Act-
news
well,
housing program in
That
county,
said,
I'm
actually,
sure.
we did get a phone call last week from Dollar Bank, who expressed interest in partnering and working with this on this legislation once passed.
And how will you go about, giving every bank a fair opportunity to, are you going to wait on their phone calls, or do you have a way that you're going to reach out to the various banks that we have here? We work with some big players already, but, there's Citizens Bank. How is that going to be equitable? How are you reaching out to the banks?
That's a great point. Currently our county treasurer we do have deposits in multiple banks. I think that would be the logical first step, and make sure that we communicate with those that we do currently partner with. But I think an RFP or an RFQ to kind of bring people to the table would be the first step.
Thank you.
To Councilwoman Conwell's point, could you envision some type of MOU among banks that might, does that make sense? Or where you bring in more than just one, or those who agree to operate in a sustainable way in this?
Yes, to the chair. I definitely would love to work with Treasurer Murray when we do the next bank RFP to see if that's another way to capture and get the participation of multiple banks for this program as well.
Did I see a hand? And I definitely know we have our master plan. Is that this year in terms of the bank deposits and services we receive back from banks based on our discounted interest rates, like the help loan program and other things?
I have to confirm that with Treasurer Murray, but I believe that they are currently working on an RFP.
Sure. Councilman Miller.
Mr. President and my colleagues, I would like to express my overall support of the legislation and say that housing, along with health, jobs and income and education, are one of the 4 pillars of economic and social well-being. And so I think it's very important that we be extensively involved in this area. The testimony I heard from the advocates today, I particularly heard concerns that the program is not comprehensive enough, and that it only covers 2 of the 6 areas that were identified in the housing plan, and also that it does not do enough to address social and economic inequities related to housing. And so I would express my aspiration that I strongly believe that in the future that this needs to be a significantly larger program, a more comprehensive program, and that it should be a vehicle for addressing the social and economic inequities in the area of housing, which are widespread and pervasive. That having been said, the purpose of this legislation is to create a framework for coordinating our efforts in dealing with housing, which we currently don't have, and is one of the 4 pillars of economic and social well-being we need to have. So I believe that this is the right place to start, and we need to take this legislation and move on it fairly quickly and get these programs up and running, and hopefully going forward that we can find ways to bring more money into this program, and we can find ways to expand its reach, and I look forward to working with everybody to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment, I guess, and a question. As Councilman Miller explained with the coordination of the framework and putting this together, obviously it sounds like there's a lot of work to be done once this is passed At what point in a year from now or 18 months from now will you have this framework in place and have the benchmarks in place for what you think draws success? That, yes, we have, in fact, 1 year from now, have accomplished through the process or outline of what it is we think this program should do as written. How will we know what is success? Have you met different benchmarks that you are trying to reach, whether it's in the 6 pillars that are demonstrated here, access to capital and housing and security? How will we know that you have in fact reached whatever benchmarks that you have put in place? If you have put those in place, how will we know the success of your program?
Thank you, Councilwoman. The legislation provides a couple places some responsibility on both the land bank and development as it relates to your question. First, it requires that both entities put together some program guidelines that fit within the guardrails of what we're putting in this piece of legislation. So, you know, in terms of what the homeowner assistance program looks like, also in terms of what the rehab and the housing market components look like. Those are things that will be reduced to writing, but sometime between now and when the program kicks off next year. As it relates to reporting and outcomes, the legislation specifically calls for particular reporting requirements. One is, some of them are micro level. So for instance, land bank and data about the number of properties they've acquired, they've rehabbed, they've, you know, disposed of in some other form or fashion. Also as it relates to contracting, MBE, WBE, those types of statistics, which they have now and will continue to provide and will provide in a formal fashion to council. Additionally, the legislation calls for some macro level reporting, and that's looking at things like the overall foreclosure rate in the county, vacancy rates, home values, private investment, and default rate of program participants. And while that is going to be an indicator of where the housing market is moving overall, you know, we always caution it's not necessarily going to be a determinative metric of whether or not the program itself is successful, because there are so many other variables that go into what affect that type of data. But we still think it's important to keep track of those things, because that is ultimately the needle we're trying to move with all of this. So I don't know if either Ken or the land bank wants to say anything as it relates to reporting, but.
Sure, to the Councilwoman, this is consistent with what was in the housing plan as well. Some of these same metrics. We're really trying to stabilize in those areas that, you know, have had negative trends and grow where we can. And I think these metrics are great indicators of the health of the housing market, as Mr. King mentioned.
Thank you, Chair. I would only add that it's good to know about the guidelines and the reporting piece. That's all. Thank you for that. And Councilwoman Yvonne mentioned about coming to us to make sure that we understand what it is that the outcomes and the guidelines are. I guess I would just ask, in the conversations that you have and you're building the blocks of the guidelines, that you think about what you would like to see as an end result. What is it that you would love to come to us and say, this is what we have accomplished? Not, you know, we stayed within the guidelines, or here's our reporting of what's, or even the macro level, but actually this is what we hoped we would do, and this is what we have done, and this is what we're striving to do in the following year. Actually have the benchmarks in place so that you know you're reaching those goals. That's all I ask in this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions from the committee? No. Any further comments? All right. All right. Well, at this time, if there are...
You need something else? Oh, okay. Looked like you wanted to say something.
Okay. If there are no further questions or comments, I will actually make a motion that we move this legislation to the full council. I'll also make note that we will have periodic comments, committee meetings, where we will again look to oversee the process and do our due diligence. Okay. So again, moved and seconded. All in favor say aye. Aye. Ayes have it. All right, our ordinance has been moved to the full council.
I'd like to add my name, Mr. Chair, if I could at this time.
Yes, you may. Would anyone else like to add their name?
Yes, please.
Councilman Miller?
I think I'm
Councilwoman
on it
Simon?
already.
All right. Any miscellaneous business?
Mr. President.
Councilman Miller.
Since most of council here, I'd like to just take this opportunity to remind everybody that our quarterly meeting on the ERP system is going to be today at 1 o'clock, and all members of the Finance and Budget Committee are requested to be present, and all other members are cordially invited to come and participate. Thank you.
And I'd also just like to thank everyone on committee for all of the work that you've all done in committee and outside of the committee, which many have not seen, all of your hard work. So again, it's very appreciated, and I think it will create a stronger piece of legislation. And again, over the course of this year, the funding starts next year. So we have time to have many more discussions. So again, thank you. If nothing else holds our attention, our meeting is now adjourned.